My name is Miller Files. I have spent many years studying murder cases across the United States. Cases that were loud and chaotic, cases that made national headlines, and cases that quietly disappeared into the archives of small-town police departments. Sometimes the quiet cases are the ones that stay with you the longest. The murder of Lela Johnston is one of those cases. At first glance, the story does not look extraordinary. A woman living alone in a quiet American town is found dead inside her own home. There are no witnesses, no obvious suspects, and no dramatic chase across state lines. The newspapers that covered the story at the time treated it as a tragic but local crime. For a few weeks, the community talked about nothing else. Then the conversation slowly faded, and life returned to normal. But when investigators opened the official case file, they realized something unsettling. The crime scene told a story that did not match the peaceful image of the town. The details suggested that the person responsible may not have been a stranger at all. In fact, the evidence hinted that the killer might have been someone the victim knew. To understand why this case remains so haunting, we have to begin with the life of Lela Johnston before the night everything changed. Lela Johnston lived a life that most people would describe as ordinary. She was known in the neighborhood as a quiet and polite woman who kept to herself. Neighbors often saw her tending to her yard or walking to the local store. She greeted people with a warm smile, but rarely lingered in long conversations. Some people described her as private, while others said she simply preferred a peaceful life. The town where she lived was the kind of place where routines rarely changed. In the mornings, people drove to work along the same roads they had used for years. Children walked to school while neighbors waved from their porches. At night, the streets became quiet, and the only sounds were distant televisions or the hum of passing cars. Places like this often create a sense of safety. People believe that violent crimes belong to large cities far away. In small towns, doors are sometimes left unlocked, and strangers stand out immediately. Residents believe that if something dangerous were happening, someone would notice. That belief would soon be tested. On the evening before her death, nothing about Lela Johnston's routine appeared unusual. According to the timeline reconstructed later by investigators, she spent the day following the same pattern she had followed countless times before. She ran errands, returned home, and settled into the quiet comfort of her house. The night outside was calm. Street lights illuminated the road in front of her home, and the surrounding houses showed the soft glow of lights in their windows. Neighbors later told police that nothing seemed strange. No loud arguments were heard. No suspicious vehicles were seen driving slowly through the area. Everything appeared perfectly normal. This is often the most unsettling aspect of certain murder cases. Life can move forward in complete calm until a single moment breaks that calm forever. The next morning, something felt wrong. It began with a simple concern. Someone who knew Lela noticed that she was not answering her phone. At first, this did not seem alarming. People sometimes step out for errands or forget to return calls. Hours passed and the silence continued. Eventually, the concern turned into worry. When someone finally checked on the house, the discovery changed the quiet neighborhood forever. Inside the home, Lela Johnston had been killed. For investigators, the first moments inside a crime scene are critical. Every detail matters. The position of objects, the condition of doors and windows, and the smallest physical traces can reveal what happened. In this case, one detail immediately stood out. There were no signs of forced entry. The doors were not broken. The windows were not shattered. The locks showed no evidence of tampering. To experienced detectives, this detail suggested something very important. Whoever entered the home may not have needed to force their way inside. In many homicide investigations, this observation leads to an uncomfortable possibility. The victim may have allowed the killer to enter. If that possibility was true, then the investigation would move in a very different direction. Instead of searching for a mysterious intruder, investigators would need to examine the people who already existed within the victim's life. That circle of individuals included neighbors, friends, relatives, and anyone who had interacted with Lela Johnston in the days before her death. Each conversation with those people would slowly build a picture of her final hours. But as the interviews began, something strange started to emerge. Small details did not match. One neighbor believed the lights in her home turned off early that evening. Another neighbor was certain that the lights remained on late into the night. Someone else mentioned seeing movement near the house, but could not say exactly when. None of these statements proved anything on their own. Yet when investigators compared them, they began to realize that the timeline surrounding Lela Johnston's final night was far less clear than expected. The case that once seemed simple was beginning to grow complicated. For detectives like me, these moments are familiar. The deeper you look into a quiet case, the more the calm surface begins to crack. Beneath that calm, you often find secrets that have been waiting for years to be discovered. The murder of Lela Johnston would eventually raise questions that extended far beyond the walls of her home. Questions about trust. Questions about hidden conflicts. And perhaps most troubling of all, questions about whether the person responsible had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. As we continue this investigation, the next step is to examine the individuals who knew Lela Johnston best. Because when there are no signs of forced entry, the truth often lies much closer to home than anyone wants to believe. My name is Miller Files, and when I look back at the investigation into the death of Lela Johnston, one of the most revealing moments in the entire case did not happen at the crime scene. It happened in the quiet rooms where detectives began asking questions. Those early conversations often determine the direction of an investigation. They reveal not only facts, but also emotions, tensions, and sometimes the smallest cracks in a carefully maintained story. When detectives began speaking with people who knew Lela Johnston, they expected to hear the same description repeated again and again. A quiet woman. A peaceful life. No enemies. For the most part, that description held true. Friends and neighbors described her as kind and reserved. She was not known for arguments or dramatic conflicts. She did not draw attention to herself, but in every investigation there comes a moment when the narrative begins to shift. The first step for investigators was to reconstruct the final days of Lela Johnston's life. They wanted to know where she had gone, who she had spoken to, and whether anything unusual had occurred in the days before her death. Detectives reviewed phone records, spoke with people who had interacted with her, and examined the small patterns that made up her daily routine. What they discovered was a life that appeared structured and predictable. She visited familiar places, spoke with a small circle of acquaintances, and spent most evenings at home. At first, this routine seemed to offer very few clues. Yet sometimes the absence of change can itself become a clue. If someone had entered her home that night without forcing the door, it suggested that the visitor was not entirely unexpected. Detectives began focusing on individuals who had been in contact with her shortly before her death. Among the first people interviewed were her neighbors. In small communities, neighbors often become the most important witnesses, not because they see everything, but because they notice subtle details others might overlook. They observe lights turning on and off, vehicles arriving late at night, and unfamiliar faces appearing in places they do not belong. Several neighbors told investigators that the evening had been unusually quiet. No one reported hearing a struggle or loud noises. One neighbor recalled seeing lights inside Lela Johnston's home late that night, though the exact time remained uncertain. Another neighbor believed that the house had become dark earlier than usual. These conflicting memories did not immediately indicate anything suspicious. Human memory can be unreliable, especially when people try to recall details after a traumatic event has already occurred. Still, the investigators carefully recorded each statement because small contradictions sometimes lead to larger discoveries. Beyond the neighbors, detectives turned their attention to the people who knew Lela Johnston on a more personal level. One of the central questions investigators asked was whether she had experienced any recent conflicts. Had she argued with anyone? Had she mentioned feeling uncomfortable or threatened? Had she spoken about someone who might have wanted to harm her? At first, the answers seemed reassuring. Many of the people who knew her insisted that she lived a quiet life without serious disputes. Yet as detectives continued their interviews, subtle hints of tension began to appear. A friend mentioned that Lela Johnston had occasionally expressed frustration about certain personal matters. The details of those frustrations were vague and not easily explained. Another acquaintance suggested that there had been disagreements involving people within her extended social circle. None of these comments alone pointed to a clear suspect. But taken together, they suggested that her life might have contained more complexity than outsiders realized. For investigators, these hints were enough to justify deeper examination. Detectives began looking closely at the timeline of her final evening. They wanted to know who might have had the opportunity to visit her home. If the killer had entered without forcing the door, the victim must have felt comfortable enough to allow that person inside. This detail changed the entire tone of the investigation. Instead of searching the streets for an unknown intruder, detectives began considering a possibility that many communities find difficult to accept. The person responsible might have been someone familiar, someone who had spoken with Lela Johnston before, perhaps even someone the community trusted. One of the most challenging aspects of this type of investigation is separating assumptions from evidence. In small towns, people often defend those they know well. They believe that violence must come from outside the community. Yet history shows that many crimes originate much closer to home. As the interviews continued, detectives noticed something interesting about the way certain individuals responded to questions. Most people answered openly and expressed shock about the tragedy. Others seemed more guarded. They provided information but appeared uncomfortable when discussing certain topics. This behavior did not automatically indicate guilt. People react to stress in many different ways. Some become talkative, while others withdraw. Still, experienced investigators pay close attention to shifts in tone, hesitation, and the subtle signals that emerge during long conversations. One question kept returning throughout the interviews. Who had visited Lela Johnston on the night she died? Some individuals claimed they had not seen her that evening. Others believed they might have spoken with her earlier in the day. A few people mentioned that it was not unusual for acquaintances to stop by her home from time to time. That detail opened an important line of inquiry. If visits were common, then a visitor on the night of the murder might not have seemed suspicious at all. A neighbor glancing through a window might have seen a familiar figure and thought nothing of it. This possibility made the investigation far more complicated. It meant that the killer might have walked into the house without drawing attention and left the same way. Another factor that investigators examined was the physical layout of the neighborhood. The homes were positioned close enough that residents could sometimes observe activity outside, yet the area was quiet enough that someone moving carefully might avoid notice. Detectives also considered the timing of the crime. If the attack occurred late at night, most people would have already been inside their homes. Televisions would have been playing softly behind closed doors. Curtains might have blocked the view of the street. In other words, the killer may have chosen a moment when the entire neighborhood was least likely to notice anything unusual. As investigators studied these possibilities, the case slowly transformed from a simple tragedy into a complicated puzzle. There was still no clear suspect. There was still no direct witness. Yet the more detectives examined the people closest to Lela Johnston, the more they began to wonder whether someone within that circle might know more than they were saying. These suspicions did not lead to immediate arrests. Instead, they deepened the mystery, because every person who spoke with investigators appeared to have an explanation, a routine, or a memory that placed them somewhere else during the crucial hours. The investigation had entered a difficult stage. Detectives now had to determine whether those explanations were truthful or whether someone had carefully constructed a story that could survive casual questioning. In cases like this, the truth rarely reveals itself quickly. It often hides beneath layers of ordinary details. And sometimes the person who appears the most ordinary is the one investigators eventually look at more closely. As we move deeper into the story of Lela Johnston's murder, we will begin to examine the hidden tensions that investigators believed might have existed beneath the calm surface of her life. Because the next stage of this investigation would raise an unsettling possibility. That the peaceful image of this small town might have concealed conflicts no one had fully understood until it was far too late. My name is Miller Files. When investigators reach the middle phase of a homicide investigation, the atmosphere often changes. The early days are filled with urgency. Officers move quickly, gather statements, collect evidence, and try to preserve every possible detail from the crime scene. But as time passes, the investigation becomes quieter and more analytical. Detectives begin studying the patterns hidden inside the information they have collected. The case of Lela Johnston entered that stage sooner than anyone expected. The crime scene itself had provided very little physical evidence. The absence of forced entry had already pushed investigators toward a troubling conclusion. Whoever entered the home